Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Gurus, where every Friday we explore stories of international business and speak with industry leaders operating around the world. I'm your host, Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. Thank you for joining us. If you're tuning in for the first time, we start each podcast with a running segment called Faux Pas Fridays, where we explore a funny blooper or mistranslation that does not quite convey the professional image that your organization wants to project. So given the problems in Ukraine right now from the Russians, I thought one from the Soviet times would be most appropriate. And a sign in a Moscow hotel said that there will be a Moscow exhibition this Tuesday of arts by 15,000 Soviet painters and sculptors. These were executed over the past 2 years. So today's guest is Jon Pedersen, a corporate finance professional with 30 years of experience in finance, technology, and operations. He has worked in the fields of banking, media, and entertainment, and is now the CFO of Health Plan One, a growing company in the Medicare distribution sector. And through his various ventures, he has done business in 150 countries, primarily in Europe and Asia, but I'm sure he can elaborate on that. So welcome, Jon. Delighted for you to be here.
Well, thanks for having me, Philip. Good to be here.
Before we dive in, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about your background and how you grew up and how you gained your global experience.
Sure thing. I mean, I was born in the Midwest. Never really thought about the global scale much as a child. We moved to the East Coast when I was a teenager. My dad got a job in Connecticut. And then once I got out of college, I got an accounting degree at University of Connecticut and had the opportunity to work in New York City for Goldman Sachs. And I thought, this is a pretty far-flung idea coming from where I came from. And the thought process of being that close to Wall Street and being that close to New York City, I felt that it was probably worth taking a shot at, even though my roots, were much more humble than that. And so I took the shot, and I think it opened up my career in a variety of different ways. And I think it changed my life because it really kind of expanded my view on, I think, what the art of the possible was. I think when you kind of grow up in sometimes small places or small towns or whatever, you don't always get to see everything you can. And I think I got lucky from the standpoint that I was able to really expand my horizons all across the country and ultimately across the world.
That's great. Yeah, I also, I grew up in Philadelphia, but my parents moved us to a small town about 40 miles outside of Philadelphia when I was in 11th grade. And that expanded my view in a different way of what small town life is like. So it was really great to have that reverse experience as well. I know you've been in various ventures and companies and perhaps launched different products or services. Can you tell us which perhaps has been the most successful and what you did to make it so?
Yeah, I've been principally on the support side. So I grew up as an accountant. I've been on the accounting finance side as a accountant or a controller or a chief financial officer. And so mostly what I've been able to do has really been provide high level support to whatever businesses that I've helped organize or run. And that can take many different forms. Sometimes it's legal, accounting, regulatory work. Sometimes it's tax work. Sometimes it is, deal work on M&A deals or selling companies or buying companies or going through bankruptcies like I did at iHeartMedia. Very, very different kind of things inside the accounting and finance realm. And so, I think what I've been most successful at is really being able to adapt and not just be the green-eyed shade accountant or not just be the finance person, but I look at these roles as you have to be an athlete and you have to be, there's this kind of triangle of what I kind of say the operations, technology, and finance, and you really have to be, conversant in all three of those things and kind of be able to move between those kind of those philosophies in terms of where you're going to spend your time and depending on what's needed in any particular situation. And so I think every job I've had and even every major situation I've dealt with over my career has called on a little bit different, set of tools in the tool belt. And so I think, what I've really learned, aside from anything, specifically is that having a diverse set of tools, and so you can really kind of meet the challenge, no matter what it is or where it is.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and sort of leads into another question I want to get to in a moment. But since you've been very involved with finance in most of your career, in finance, you can't really afford to make major mistakes, unlike in marketing, for example, which often is experimenting to see which version works. So could you share with us perhaps a big business blunder, either one of your own or one that you've heard about, in international business, and what lessons our audience should learn from it?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I saw at Goldman, Goldman had a very interesting way of looking at the world, and every time something would go wrong somewhere, they were generally the group that would come in and buy on the cheap. And I think what I've seen a lot of blunders out there in the world is that the markets sometimes overreact to system shocks or other things, and people panic and people get out, and then the well-capitaled people come in and buy low, and they're able to kind of weather the storm and make a lot of money off other people's either their mistakes or their fear in that regard. I think that even what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia right now is that, regardless of what happens to the ruble today and what happens to the Russian stock market once it opens up again, 10, 20 years from now, or even 5 years from now, or a year from now, there will be some sort of recovery, right? And so I think asset prices move, and I think sometimes people, panic. You could see the same thing in 2008. Right. With the global crisis, I was at West LB at the time. We were doing a lot of securitization vehicles. And even though, a lot of these gigantic securitization vehicles and mortgage-backed vehicles were distressed, clearly, they probably turned out to be 96 or 97% money good. And yet the world collapsed, mostly out of fear. And ultimately, most of the mortgages, paid off a lot better than, and most of these vehicles and paid off a lot better than anybody ever expected them to. But, I always look at it's like until the recent kind of, I always thought about it like this: if your car is worth $40,000, that might be great, but what if you had to sell it in the next 5 minutes? Well, then it's not worth $40,000 unless unless you happen to be in a car auction. But I think that's kind of the thing, is that asset prices and the way people behave, there's generally a lot of panic, and when there's stress in the system, you get a lot of really disconnected outcomes. And so I've seen both the good and the bad of those sorts of things. And even when I was at Goldman, every now and then there would be some sort of catastrophic trading loss of $50 or $100 million here or there, which seems like not a lot of money today, but back in the late 90s it could have been. But generally somebody would get boxed in with a position, everybody on the street knew they had it, and then wouldn't let them trade out of it. And so it's when you see those kind of things, I think they're really interesting, but ultimately, patience wins the day in a lot of cases, and most of the time you can recover, unless there's been some sort of structural change in a business, where obviously it's not profitable to make asbestos anymore, right? But but those, outside of those kind of things, there's sometimes these up and down shocks create some really interesting behavior, some good, some bad.
Yeah, it's very true. And as you said, the 2008 financial crisis was pretty devastating, but the world recovered from it pretty quickly. Right. You touched on it. You were talking about it previously, and so we've talked about sort of successes and difficulties in business. But what do you think a person needs to learn or to experience to thrive in doing international business? And you've already talked about some, but perhaps you can elaborate.
Yeah, I think some of it has to come down to, you know, like the company I work in now, and when I was at iHeartMedia, those are most domestically based businesses. And so some of the things you have to think about are there's less complications. But one of the things when you really expand into international business, you have to really take some additional things into account because tax rules are going to be different. You have transfer pricing. You have even the way your entities interact with each other. You can do some really interesting things on the tax or transfer pricing front. You can also make some terrible mistakes in terms of capital allocation and how to get money in and out of countries. And those are sorts of things that you kind of take for granted if you're, you know, living and working and doing business only in the US. It's much simpler. And I think, you know, aside from the, you know, the mechanics of all of those pieces, then you also have to get into the cultural aspects, given the fact that it's easier to do business as an American. It's easier to do business in some countries and much more difficult to do them in other countries, also depending on what sort of business you're doing and whether you're transacting with a, you know, somebody in another country, or you're actually setting up operations inside another country. There's a lot of things to think about, and I've done, you know, everything from, you know, having subsidiaries in various European, Asian, South American countries, as well as setting up BPO operations or offshore operations in India, and having, you know, done some of those sorts of things as well. And they each present their own challenges, and you just have to really be super open-minded, and you have to be a student of you know, tax law, culture, et cetera, everything across the board to make sure that you are well equipped to deal with what may come.
Yeah, and you were mentioning quite a lot about cultural issues. Since you've done business in 150 countries, of course, you know, the tax laws and the financial rules and so forth are pretty fixed, you know, with the country. But where people can get in trouble, of course, is in the cultural issues primarily. Can you give us some examples of perhaps how a cultural difficulty might have jeopardized or doomed a venture that you were working on? Or if not one of yours, then perhaps one that you've heard of.
Yeah, I know that, you know, doing a lot of work around, when I was at Goldman, I spent a lot of time with our Asian businesses, and, you know, spending some time in Asia and spending quite a bit of time, not video chats back then. It was always conference calls in the middle of the night. But really trying to, you know, move the ball forward on a lot of things, because I was there at Goldman when Goldman went public, and so trying to kind of change the way the business operated partially as part of the IPO process. You know, even trying to you know, make changes and deal with certain things as an American and a young American. I was in my 20s at the time as well, and so not really having, you know, probably the right level of maturity in some cases, or the experience understanding Asian culture. You know, there were times where I was a little bit of a bull in the china shop, so to speak, and really kind of rubbed some people the wrong way. And had it not been for, I think, a couple of you know, people in our Asian offices that were either American or European, or even Asian people that had spent a lot of time in the States, to kind of pull me aside and says, listen, we know that you're trying to, you know, implement some new technology, implement some new infrastructure, get people to buy in. Like, there's a way to do that here, and you're not doing it properly, right? And so kind of having that counsel from people that were super helpful, I learned a lot. And so it's kind of one of those things where you're never really trying to be disrespectful, but sometimes if you don't understand what's respectful and disrespectful in somebody else's culture, you can really you know, stub your toe and put yourself in a spot unintentionally. But it's really important to kind of understand that.
You mentioned that a lot of your experience was when you were younger, and, you know, you encountered these difficulties in all of Asia. I was going to say India, but in all of Asia, especially Asia, seniority is valued and youth is sort of devalued. And there's both in the languages as well as in the culture, there's a very high respect for people who are older, and, you know, you have to defer to them, even if they're wrong, for example. Did you encounter any of those difficulties specifically, and how did you adjust to those?
Yeah, I could definitely sense that part of the issue, especially in my early time in Asia, was partially due to my age, where it was kind of, this is not just a brash American, it's a young brash American, and I didn't probably have the capital or the personal capital to kind of get through what I needed to get done. I do know that, as my career went on and I was more senior, I know we did some business in India. When I was at Warner Music Group, given that I had probably started getting a gray hair or two in those days, going over there as a senior executive versus a junior executive, you get treated very, very, very differently, right? And understanding that, if I was senior vice president and controller of Warner Music Group, I'm an important person, and
Right.
so walking around during site visits and other things, dealing with our some of our business process outsourcing that we had done out there, it was very, very different feeling coming from that, having a little bit of that seniority and that capital and power, I guess, for lack of a better term. It certainly does change the game. And so part of what you have to be is you have to be self-aware to understand both when you have that power or that cachet or when you don't, and understand the dynamics of all the things you're trying to get through. I think I look at it in a way of it's like game theory to some extent, right? Because every culture, every business situation, there's a set of rules and there's the desired outcome. So in some way you're playing a game and you need to make sure you understand the rules of the game that you're in. And so you kind of make sure that you achieve the desired outcome. And that can be very, very different depending on, which group of people, what country, what situation you're dealing with. And I think you have to be cognizant. You can't be like, the proverbial, construction worker where everything is a nail and you're the hammer, right? It's like, it can't be that. It's not that simple. You have to make sure that you have some nuance and understand the situations that you're in, for sure.
Yeah, there's an expression in various Asian languages, the equivalent of basically the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, which means more conforming, of course.
Yeah.
But to build upon what you said, as you called yourself a young brash American, was it hard to get people, since you were a young American, was it hard? How did you get people to buy into the changes you needed to make or you wanted to make?
Well, it was trying to find the right people locally. And in most larger companies, you're going to have some people, no matter where you are in the world, that have gone to school in America or Europe or whatever, or somebody that can kind of help you through the cultural or the language barriers. And I think, being able to, socialize, quite frankly, sometimes, being able to go out, in Tokyo and eat sushi and kind of show that you want to,
Blend in
blend in or and even just take part in their culture, and that you respect their culture, and you don't want to go to, hey, let's go to Japan and go to a steak, like an American steakhouse, right? It's like, when I go to India, I eat Indian food. I try to go local because I think it's respectful, and I think you really do, they appreciate that, right? When you're trying to, you show that, like, you respect them and you're not just there for business only, that you actually want to be there in a larger sense. And I think that's been helpful.
Yeah, that sounds great. You're absolutely right. I've experienced that myself. If you had the chance to give your past self some current advice, what would you tell yourself looking back?
I would actually say that that if you have an opportunity to take a rotation where you actually can work overseas for an extended period of time, I know that doesn't work for everybody, but I think that, I spent a lot of time overseas. I did some really interesting things, but I think I missed the opportunity to potentially live in London for a year, or live in Dusseldorf for a year, or live in Asia for a year. And I think that those experiences would have been really valuable for me from a business perspective, and I think personally. I think the more you know about the world, the better you are. I know when my kids were in middle school and high school, I sent them on a number of different international, 3-week trips here and there, because I just think that understanding the world as it is, not as how you think it might be,
Right.
I think is really, really important, because, I just think that the world, given technology, continues to get smaller and smaller. But yet there are still a lot of fundamental kind of differences in the way people are on a day-to-day basis, and you can think that you know people, but until you really kind of spend time in places and really eat in their restaurants and talk to people and really kind of understand who people are, that you really don't fundamentally understand them. And I think sometimes we live in this Twitter world and everything's 140 characters or whatever else, and everything's snippets. And I think if you don't really spend that time to really kind of understand a little bit more broadly and deeply, that I think you miss out on some of that. And I think that's where you get some of that really great enrichment, because I think some of the time I did spend overseas, I really, really valued.
Yeah, you mentioned Twitter and so forth. The United States is basically an instant culture.
Yes.
Instant fast food and instant, answers to anything, and an email message or an ad has to resonate within 3 seconds and so forth. And what I think you're also alluding to or referring to is that in most parts of the world, relationships are really key, and building those relationships, and one does it over meals and over just ongoing conversations. And very often, well, in many cases, you can't really do business until people trust you, and they don't trust you until you have developed that relationship. So Americans tend to just, you use the word brash, it's wonderful. Americans tend to just rush in and, hello, how are you? My name is this. How can we, which product of ours would you like? Or which product of ours are you most interested in? And that's absolutely not the way it works.
Yeah, I thought that came through a lot when I worked at West LB, which was one of the German Landesbanks that had a U.S. branch, and so working for the U.S. branch and being CFO of the U.S. broker dealer, we had a business that we were running here that we were responsible to report into Dusseldorf, and I spent a lot of time in Dusseldorf, and really, being in a company that was headquartered in Germany is very, very different than being a company that's headquartered in New York that has an office in Germany. So those two offices, will behave very, very differently. And I know that the New Yorkers often got frustrated by the pace of getting decisions done or made in Germany, but the Germans have generally been a lot more thoughtful and deliberate about the way they do things, and also a lot more conservative, quite frankly. And in that, the getting to the respect. I mean, I think you may have studied German at some point in time too. I think I read in your background, yes. And I had studied German for 6 years or so. And although I'm not an expert at it by any stretch, I remember sitting in offices in Dusseldorf and people talking over me because they figured I couldn't understand them. And every now and then I would raise my hand and say, like, I can't really engage in this conversation in German because my German's not so good. But I think I know what you're talking about, and you probably shouldn't. And so sometimes those language things can be a little bit funny. But I think the fact that even understanding what they were saying gave them a little bit, they respected that to some extent, because I kind of chimed in. It's like, okay, this guy understands German, so he's not a complete Neanderthal, right?
That's wonderful. I guess there's also the experience of you're in another country and the locals assume you don't know the language, and you're in an elevator and they talk about you. Yeah. That American's wearing such funny clothes, or and says something negative, and you can then pop in the language saying, "Oh, thank you very much for that delightful compliment," or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
Of the countries that you've worked in, I'm curious if there's any one or two that seem to be more difficult than others.
I think from my experience, Japan was particularly difficult. Just I think mostly cultural, and just trying to kind of get things done the speed that you'd want to get them done, and having to kind of navigate around, especially in the banking side of things. They just behave very, very differently.
Yeah.
And so that I think was difficult for me. And I think in Germany, trying to kind of maneuver with a German parent company, I thought was pretty difficult. Where when I was doing other business in Germany, where I was working for an American parent, it was not that difficult to do business in Germany. And what I learned through that process is that I don't think I ever want to work in the U.S. for a foreign headquartered company. If you want to work in Europe, you'd want to work for a U.S. based company, just because the dynamics are a little bit different, and it's like a different set of math almost, than what you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so I think sometimes it's the country, and sometimes it's this actual business circumstance that you're in, and kind of what you're there to go do. And so I think that's what I've learned, is that you can't really kind of pigeonhole or stereotype any particular country as being a certain way, because depending on what you're trying to do there and who you're trying to do it with, you have a very, very distinct set of outcomes that are there, and potentially behaviors that you need to kind of exhibit to be able to get things done. And so I think it's really been about, for me, in any situation, is you have to be able to kind of read the room and understand where you are and what you're trying to accomplish and who you're trying to accomplish it with. And I think that, in some regards, it's like even doing business in New York City versus doing business in Memphis, right? It's like, I know we say this is one country, but like, this isn't really one country either. It's like a whole bunch of little countries that are all part of America. So I think that translates, to a lot of things. I think you just have to be open and understanding, and understand the circumstances where you're in to maximize whatever you're doing.
Very true. Very true. Before we close, is there anything further you'd like to share with us? Or perhaps tell us a bit about life outside of work. What else do you like to do?
Well, I have a couple of things I think I would say. One is that the interesting thing about, the world is that, a lot of, we're US centric people kind of think that all of the best ideas kind of come from the US. But I think that even in the, when I was in the music business, the world was trying to build the best streaming platform, and the Swedish with Daniel Ek and Spotify crushed everybody, right? And I don't even think most Americans really realize that Spotify isn't like a Silicon Valley company that it was made out of Europe. And I think that with that, you can understand that there's a lot of great companies and great businesses that kind of come from all over. And I think that, for me, I think it's really interesting and enriching to have been kind of part of a lot of the things that I've seen over the years. But I think when you look at the outside part of your life, that you want your work life to be as interesting and fulfilling as it can. But at the end of the day, for most people, we're doing what we do to make money, to do the other things in our life that we want to go do, hopefully, if we've got that balance right. And so, I have two, young adult children. I spend a lot of time, going to sporting events or concerts, absent COVID issues or whatever. A lot of travel, a lot of golf, and really spend, my life trying to use, the things that I've been able to do well in business to enhance the personal life for myself, my wife, my family, my kids. And so we can all enjoy all the great things that the world has to offer. And I think having traveled a lot, and having had my kids and my wife and everybody travel a lot, I think that, we feel that we're kind of outdoor cats, right? We're not homebodies. We want to get out and experience the world. And I think that that's one of the things that, coming from where I came from, seeing all the countries I've been to, all the trips and travel and everything else that I've done, I never as a child imagined that that's what my life would be like. And I think, the ability to kind of get into big companies and do international travel and international business really changed the way I saw the world. And I can then hand that down to my children as well. And I think that they're more well-rounded and better off because of that as well. And so for me, I always tell people to take advantage of the opportunities that you can, because as great as America is, and I love it here, I just think it's really, really interesting to see how the rest of the world lives. And I think that there's a lot that we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, very, very true. Well, thank you so much for your incredible insights. You've certainly covered a huge gamut of issues dealing with international business and culture and different methods and so forth. And it's really delightful to hear, to be with someone who has such a broad background, broad experience. And this has been an interview with Jon Pedersen, and I'm Philip Auerbach. Please join us again next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories on international business.
Thanks for having me, Philip.
Thank you.